Hello and welcome to the DEVIANT'S Tour Miami. I am so excited to be here today with one of my academic and personal heroes, Professor Vincent Brown, and some wonderful co-hosts. And before we get into the introductions and talking about some of our wonderful co-hosts, I would be remiss not to acknowledge the pain that our nation is feeling amidst the loss of Black lives at the hands of our nation's law enforcement. To the Black folks who may be watching, your lives matter. To my predominantly white fans, we must do better. I've posted a link in our Crowdcast description for those who are looking to make a difference, for our friends who identify as QTPOC. In the meantime, please join me in a moment of silence to honor the lives of Tony McDade, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and too many others. Thank you. I'm now pleased to introduce Orlando Gonzalez, who is representing a local nonprofit, and we'll speak a little bit about the incredible work they do. Orlando, are you with us? I can't see you. Okay, well, he's getting reconnected.
Can you see me and hear me okay?
Oh, I can hear you now.
We don't see you.
I can see you.
Can you hear me and
really?
see me?
I can only hear you. Why don't?
Yeah, I think it's just sort of a little modern day hiccups, but thanks so much.
Sure thing. Could you give us a little bit of an introduction of the great work y'all do?
So yeah, absolutely. Thank you. As you said, I'm Orlando Gonzalez, and I'm the Executive Director of SAVE, which stands for Safeguarding American Values for Everyone. I think it's important to state that my pronouns are he, him, and his. I really want to thank you for having me here today. I'm delighted to be your host, along with our friends over at Books and Books. They're great community partners, and I feel like Books and Books is always doing the right thing, right people, so I'm in good company. I'm really grateful for today's book chance to read a small excerpt, so I can't wait to continue to read more about it. Really, is so important to be able to read about, and I know that so many people know about Stonewall, but when parts of this go to periods in time prior to Stonewall, I think it's an opportunity to really be able to pick up on some of the silenced narratives that are out there. To tell you a little bit about the mission of SAVE, our work is to promote, protect, and defend equality for people in South Florida who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. SAVE is a nonpartisan organization, but we do political work. We do our work heavily dependent on volunteers, and I start addressing public policy. The way that we interview kids that are running for public office to determine if they are supportive of our community. So we know that we can't pass legislation without having the right people in office to be able to get that work done. So our work is first to get them into office and seek to have pro-equality legislation process of endorsing people. We depend on volunteers. So LGBTQ people, as well as allies, are always a part of that process, and the community votes on that. So it's always really important that we have them with us. The work of SAVE has been done since 1993, and that started with the 1998 passage of the Miami-Dade Human Rights Ordinance. That stemmed from the reversal, really, of an incredible and inclusive ordinance, as some people recall the Anita Bryant days, right? The orange Jewish heir apparent that really made efforts to hurt our community. But in 1998, we succeeded in overturning those efforts. Then in 2002, we had to defend that again, and that was something we were really proud to do. Of course, prior to marriage equality, SAVE helped pass a domestic partnership ordinance. So it was sort of the base of what we had to do in order to make do what we could with our loving couples. In 2014, we then helped to modernize that rights ordinance as we began to look at gender identity expression to protect members of the transgender community. So our work has continued. Of course, right now we're tackling issues of conversion therapy, and we passed our first law in Miami Beach in 2016 and have continued to do that with 6 other cities throughout South Florida. We continue to do our work, and a lot of what we're doing is really focused on ending discrimination throughout the state, and we do that with partners all throughout the state of Florida who are really strong and united together. So now I'm gonna hand it over to our other host, who is somebody who is familiar with SAVE. He has a history with SAVE as he's been involved with us, and he's a dear friend of mine. So he's here with Books and Books and the book fair. Shed, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Orlando. I'm excited to share the platform, Orlando and SAVE, because I was one of the co-founders, which meant I was one of Damien's friends doing the work behind the scenes to make sure that the original group happened. And one of the things from the very beginning of SAVE, we recognized the importance of building community. And that was, as we built our own LGBT community and the supporters, we also made sure that we reached out to the Black communities, meaning the African-American communities, the Haitian communities, et cetera, the Jewish community and the Latin community. And we really brought it all together and recognized those communities as we all searched for our success. And so it's great timing to have this conversation when our brothers and sisters in the African-American community are suffering so much in particular right now. So I'm honored that we started with a moment of silence. And I just want to remind everybody that none of us are free until all of us are free. The other thing that I wanted to say is Orlando was saying about the original human rights ordinance in Dade County that passed in 1977. And then a woman named Anita Bryant came up and actually got rid of that ordinance. And what most people don't realize is that when that ordinance first happened, everybody said that'll pass when hell freezes over. But on the day that it passed, it snowed for the first and only time in recorded. And so I do want to encourage those as you read this book, or after you read this book, sort of look at the 1977 struggle, because I was part of the team that brought you the film, The Day It Snowed in Miami, which you can get on YouTube for free. But it sort of takes you through SAVE's development as we looked at the ordinance of 77 and then take it back till we finally got it originally passed, or again passed in 1998. So it took 21 years to pass the ordinance all over again. I'm also honored to represent Books and Books tonight. Books and Books has been a local treasure for many, many years. And it's not only a good bookstore, but it's a great community resource and a great restaurant and great music. And so I really want to make sure that we're all supporting it. And you can see that there's the Purchase the Deviant's War down below. And I really want to encourage all of us to make sure we buy it from Books and Books, because it really is a community resource and a treasure. And I'm sure that no one's told me this, but I'm sure they've gone through a difficult time lately with all the pandemic and all of that stuff. So we really do want to make sure that we support that. We also want to make sure that come November, we're going to all actively participate in the Miami Book Fair, which is one of the great things that does happen here in Miami. So I just want to encourage everyone to not only buy the book, but be prepared for the book fair. It's always a great event. So now I have the honor of introducing our speaker, and then I guess our moderator. Vincent Brown is a professor of American history and African American studies at Harvard University. He's won several awards, and too many to name here. So Vincent, we'll just appreciate your history and where you're coming from. And I take it Eric was one of your students, is that?
That's right, yeah.
So I just put 2 and 2 together. And then I introduce Eric here, who is from the little town next to the little town I went to college in Texas, although I was already in, you weren't born when I was in college, so I knew your town before you did. And he graduated from Harvard College in 2014, and he got his PhD in history from the University of Cambridge. where he was a Gates Scholar. And this is his first book, The Deviants' War. And so far, it's an exciting read. And I have to say, you start out with the tea room trade. And that was one of the first representations, as negative as it was seen and should be seen. It was still one of the first representations of sexuality and gay sex identification that I ever saw. So I still has a special place in my heart. So thank you for reminding us of that book. Thank you for sharing me with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Orlando and Shed and both of the teams at Save and Books and Books. As Shed said, independent bookstores right now more important than ever, not just because they're a place where you can buy books, but because they're places of community where we can be having these important conversations that otherwise wouldn't be happening. So thank you for providing them. If you don't mind, I'm gonna minimize y'all, but thank you. Let me see how I do this. There we go. Excellent. All right. Well, so Vince.
Go away.
Oh, there we go. Well, Vince, thank you so much for being here. I mean, it's truly an honor and also serendipitous because you have your own book that came out in almost the exact same timeline.
Yeah, just a couple of months ago.
Yeah. So thank you so much for being here. It's such, I've been telling everyone that History Design Studio, for people who don't know, is one of the most incredible things that I experienced at Harvard. And you taught me that history does not need to just be a book. There are other ways of telling history.
Never has been just a book, right?
So thank you so much. You're still in Boston right now, aren't you?
I'm in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Yeah, I'll be here. I'm still here in the basement. Every once in a while, getting out to a protest. In Cambridge, we have these little mom and pop protests, which I've taken the kids to, which are important to do because it's important for the kids to see. Because as you alluded to, we're in a really difficult and dangerous time in this country right now. I very much appreciate you using your platform to draw attention to these common struggles. Because it is and has been far too easy to kill Black people in this country. It is and has been far too easy to hate and discriminate against LGBTQ people in this country. And in some ways, that's partly because it's just difficult and still radical to say Black is beautiful and gay is good. Those fundamental premises are still not as widely accepted as they need to be. And that partly underlies the problems that we have in the society. So thank you for writing this book. I think it's fantastic. You mentioned that you were a student of mine, and you know, teachers always want to take credit for people that they taught, but everybody should know that Eric Savini came to me with everything he needed. I would love to say that I had something to do with your success, which I'm very proud of, but you were always going to do what you do. So I'm just really pleased to see you doing it. This is a fantastic book. Anybody who hasn't started it yet should start it as soon as they get off the screen here with us, because one of the things that Dr. Savini is able to do so well is he's able to recreate the gay rights struggle of the last half of the 20th century, almost as if you were there, as if you could see it unfolding before your eyes. He's got this brilliant sense of chronological narrative. So you see the predicament of the activists, even before they become activists. You see them transform, recognize, and awaken to the need for activism. And then you see their struggles as they play out over really about a half century in the United States. And it's just a wonderful work. I want to ask some questions about it. I want, first of all, I mean, I know not many people will have read it already. So why don't you begin by just telling us who was Frank Cameney and how did you get interested in it?
Well, thank you. I mean, thank you for the kind words, Vincent. You do need to take credit because, like I said, I did not go into college wanting to be a historian, certainly did not go into college or even into your class wanting to be a popular historian.
Oh, we turned you out.
Exactly. And I think a lot of people assume that to be a historian means you have to be locked up all day in the archives, which is an amazing part of being a historian. And writing is a painful but exciting part of being a historian, but there are so many other ways to tell stories, and I learned that from you, Vince. So thank you, for passing that on. Who is Frank Cameney? Well, I warned you before, I'm going to turn around a lot of the questions back to you, because I think the Deviants' War, in order to understand gay history, you have to understand the history of the Black freedom movement. You have to understand the traditions that emerged there, which came, I think, out of the same traditions that you discuss in Tacky's Revolt. So I'm warning you, I'm gonna turn them around, but I will for people
I'm ready
who don't.
for you.
All right. Well, for people who don't know, Frank Cameney was a Harvard-educated astrophysicist. Unlike me, he had a PhD from Harvard, and was an astronomer at the very launch of the space race. Was working for the Army Map Service as a civilian, and then just as we were talking about earlier, the book begins with a bathroom sex scene, because that is where he was caught by two police officers hiding in a ceiling, looking down at him from through a ventilation grill. The government found out about that arrest. He lost his job immediately, because every single astronomy-related job required a security clearance. He wasn't able to find a job in his own field. And because of that, he started living in poverty. And unlike most people in that position, because thousands and thousands, countless thousands were forced to resign, or were fired, purged from the government, he was really the first to fight back, first to take it to the Supreme Court, first to argue against the gay purges in Congress, first to picket in front of the White House against these purges. And really, I argued, was responsible for essentially Xeroxing what you have occurring in the Black freedom movement during the 60s, replicating it and translating it, just like you said, translating Black is beautiful to gay is good. And so I think it shows, we borrowed through Frank gay rights, gay pride from the Black freedom movement. And it raises a lot of questions, especially about respectability. And so even though he did a lot of the hard work, we still have to say, all right, what does it mean that his organization was mostly white while still doing this? So it's a complicated legacy, but I think it's an important one.
Okay, I want to take that apart a little bit, because Frank Cameney is such an interesting figure for me, in part because in writing about slave revolt, and as Eric mentioned, I just finished a book on the largest slave revolt in the history of in the 18th century British Empire. And one of the leaders of that slave revolt had been a military official in West Africa, a man of very high status, who happened to be enslaved, sold to Jamaica, where this slave revolt happened. And then the first attempt to try and free himself was to negotiate with a planter who was going to redeem him and have him sent home. His first attempt was not to lead a slave revolt. That wasn't his first strike at freedom. It was only when he realized that that wasn't going to work that he became a slave rebel. So what is it about that process where it's people who have status and then find their avenues to greater status foreclosed that turns them toward activism and rebellion?
Mm-hmm. And just as a little bit of a plug for you and also both of us, Tacky's Revolt, Vince's book, the link to it, if you click the little I next to the title, where it says Miami, Eric's Reunion Conversation with Vincent Brown, click the little I, you can buy and read more about Tacky's Revolt. And I think that process you see time and time again in history of people, especially those used to having status. Someone like Frank Cameney, middle class, New York City, did pretty well for himself, white, was used to being able to work things out. being able to negotiate. If there's a misunderstanding, as he thought he would be able to frame that tea room arrest as a misunderstanding, you see, oh, well, that was just like a one-time thing. He goes to a psychiatrist to get the psychiatrist to say that he's straight. And then when that doesn't work, then he goes to the courts. When that doesn't work, he starts lobbying directly with Congress people, but then he sees that doesn't work either. So it's this building frustration that you see of using official channels that continuously fail and are fruitless, and this building frustration and this kind of Kafkaesque gaslighting of a bureaucracy telling you that, oh, go talk to this person. Oh, go talk to that branch of the government. Go, it's not our role as Pentagon officials to be changing federal legislation. And so at a certain point, and I think you see it in your book, in the Black Freedom Movement, in gay rights with Frank Cameney's story, and right now today, you see where you say, enough is enough. We have to do more.
Again, it's one of the fantastic things about your book is you show that process moment by moment of frustration and then trying to resolve that some way, hitting another wall and moving on and on progressively. And there's a kind of dawning realization that he's going to have to go even from gay is good to, as you say, blatant is beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And I love the way that you take him on that journey from first trying to be a normative middle-class white guy. That's the struggle. To saying, no, actually, I'm finally free when I'm dancing with lots of people who are not like me, who are not normative middle-class white people. And I just thought that was a fantastic arc to show that you go from trying and struggling to fit in as being the impetus to the struggle to being free.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was really fantastic the way you did that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, it raises the question of whether if you succeed at fitting in, are you really free? Right. And I think, the queer community is asking that same exact question today.
Yeah, that's right. Can I ask you a little bit about place? Because you did this fantastic project at History Design Studio where you took the FBI surveillance files on the Madison Society. And for those who don't know, Frank Cameney was the founder of the Madison Society of Washington, D.C., and its leader for a very long time. And it was under surveillance by the FBI. And you got, through a Freedom of Information Act request, I believe, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The FBI files on the Madison Society. And then you mapped out their movements across D.C. and the movements of the people who were surveilling them across D.C. So Lafayette Park is again in the news as site of major protests on behalf of Black lives, but also against the Trump administration, and a site of the Trump administration's authoritarian, spectacular displays. Lafayette Park plays a central role both in the project that you did in History Design Studio, but also in the beginning of the book. Can you talk a little bit about Lafayette Park and more generally place as it shapes your story?
Mm-hmm. Well, the fun fact about that project, Vince, I don't know if I ever told you, is I had it up for a few years after graduating college, and then it got hacked, I think by Russian hackers. Basically had to, right? Of course.
Fake news.
All of it fake news. It was actually, it was a little scary because there was like this Russian propaganda or something that took over because I hadn't been maintaining it or, updating it. So I wish I could share that project with the world, but they'll have to take your word for it. But no, I think, and I have to thank you for that, because forcing me to think about it spatially, I think, is so important, because you realize, especially in Washington, D.C., that you can't tell the story, especially of pre-Stonewall gay rights and the homophile movement, without also discussing segregation. And you see, even within Lafayette Park, which literally across the street from the White House, it was a cruising ground. So people would go, just like now you have iPhone apps to find casual sex, you would go to a park, and going all the way back to, the 1920s, there are records of people segregating even that park, and it would down to individual benches where this bench is where, you know, the black queers would go. This is where the sailors would go. And, you know, it was essentially a marketplace.
That anticipates the segregation in dating apps, right?
Exactly. Nothing has changed. I mean, that's my big takeaway. I wanted to do one event on like sex in the 60s. And the big takeaway, without having to do a full event on it, is nothing has changed. I mean, there's just racism is rampant, as it was. But yeah, I think it shows how, you know, Frank's world was white. The Mattachine was predominantly white, especially in the downtown gay world, especially close to Lafayette Square and the YMCA. Those were white gay bars, and there were separate gay bars that were for people of color. And you see also in the FBI recognizing that fact and tracking them as two completely different communities. And I think you see that same thing today. And it's important to be looking at it spatially to visually see segregation, de facto or not, at work.
So how things play out in a place is one way to look at space. The kind of cultural habits that one develops in a place is another way to look at space. We often think of the story of gay rights and LGBTQ history as a coastal story, a story that's kind of headquartered in New York or San Francisco, maybe sometimes Chicago, and certainly in your case, DC. But Texas also plays a surprisingly large role in this story, right? We've got, you know, Congressman Doughty from Texas. We've got Randy Wicker from Texas, and you're from Texas as well. So I just want to know if Texas somehow shapes this story in a different way than we would be accustomed to telling it. Like, if you being from Texas, what does that mean to the way you tell the story, to the kinds of people you feature, and to the kinds of things you have to say? I mean, you don't editorialize a whole lot, which I appreciate in this book, but what you say about Congressman Doughty, I thought was kind of fun. You say, Doughty was a self-made man in the truest sense, the Texan sense. Right? There was something about that that was so Texan. The way you put that, I was like, oh, he's in there. Tell me about Texas in this book.
That's funny. Well, the other thing is the one sure way to get re-election is if you're against, I think it was quote unquote Negroes and queers. If there's one way to win in Texas, was if you were against those two groups. Hand in hand. But it's so funny. We were just talking to Shed earlier. Maybe we can bring him back on in a little bit about Central Texas. But my big takeaway from Texas is less about, you know, the racism and the bigotry, in a more inspiring front of how, despite that bigotry and homophobia at the time, there was a vibrant gay world. You talk to Randy Wicker. This didn't really make it into the book too much, but you talk to Randy Wicker, he can tell you every single restroom where you would want to go on the University of Texas campus if you wanted a casual encounter. Just like, you know, now online exactly where you can find that same exact thing. That same marketplace existed and was overlaid, and bar life also was very vibrant even in the 1950s in Austin. So just as, you know, other historians have done great work, like George Chauncey in New York City, there were these subcultures that existed in a very vibrant form long before Stonewall, and all over the country. In Miami as well. I mean, you see the Johns report. If for people who may not know, there was an entire investigation on the state congressional level into the infiltration of homosexuals into the university and the government. So, and they ended up actually publishing some pretty raunchy photographs in the congressional report that itself ended up getting them in a lot of trouble. So there's fun parts too about some of the resistance that was happening in less explicit means.
Well, I like the way you put that, because it draws attention to the fact that, you know, we characterize these places in one way, and their general characterizations that you have to burrow beneath to really understand what's going on, which draws attention to that spatial history that you're talking about, right? Which is, you don't really understand DC unless you understand Lafayette Park and what happens there. You don't understand Texas, right, as an entity even, unless you understand how particular subcultures within Texas, different kinds of resistance, shape the political struggles within that state. And I think you bring that out really well.
Thank you.
So thank you for that. I want to talk a little bit, especially because we're in the moment we're in, about what you think that the gay rights struggle learned from the civil rights struggle and the Black Power struggles. But then I also want to flip it a little bit because, you know, we have just had a pretty tremendous, spectacular success with 2015's Obergefell versus Hodges decision on marriage equality. And that kind of capped a very successful period in gay rights activism. I want to ask you if you think there's something that the movement for Black Lives can learn from queer struggles of the most recent period as well. So if you could do kind of both sides, like your story is partly about what queer rights activists learned from African-American struggles. But I wonder also what African-Americans can learn from those gay rights struggles.
Yeah, I think.
And of course, there are gay African-Americans that are learning both at the same time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think it's so important to recognize that. And there have been really good comparisons now, you know, especially this week, saying, you know, in the middle of Pride Month with the parades canceled and in the middle of this national reckoning we're experiencing on the racial front, that we as cis gay white men need to remember that Stonewall was a riot, and that it was led by gender nonconforming and trans women of color.
Yeah.
And yes, that is important. But I actually think that minimizes the role of the Black freedom movement. And I think it minimizes the role of trans women of color in the movement for queer liberation. And I think it's important to also be recognizing figures like Ernestine Eppinger, who was the first Black woman to march for gay liberation years before Stonewall. And, you know, when you listen to her voice, I think what's so shocking about her perspective and how important intersectionality is when you listen to the question asked of her, what should our movement be focusing on? And this answers the second part of your question. What should our movement be focusing on? Or as a Black lesbian woman, what do you think is next? And she says, you know who we're forgetting? Trans people within our community. And this is a Black woman, lesbian, who is saying this, who is recognizing that this movement that is predominantly white, almost universally white, is forgetting the most marginalized, who then a few years later become the first to actually put their bodies on the line, at least in a large media covered spectacle, because of course there were prior uprisings before that. So,
right, and as Chev said, no one is free until everybody's free.
Exactly.
But can we talk about that for a minute? Why is it that more people aren't talking about Tony McDade? You drew attention to this on your platform. And would you just talk about why that doesn't make the same kind of news it should?
I think we still live in a transphobic society. I think the reason, when you talk to someone like Randy Wicker, right, he's still alive, he's 81 years old. He's really my template for how every cis gay white man should behave and how should they mold their thinking in this radicalizing moment. In that he is the first to admit that back in the 60s and even continuing up until the 2000s, he was transphobic and misogynistic. I think he would call himself a transphobic, misogynistic, chauvinist pig, in his words, right, of himself. And he's the first to recognize that, because part of the strategy of that movement, of the pre-Stonewall movement and beyond, well into the 2000s, was to sacrifice trans members of our community, especially trans women of color, in order to be more palatable to not just the Republican Party, but the Democratic Party, to everyone, to all politicians on all sides, because they assumed then, you know, maybe we can get at least some protection for the gays, for the white gays, right? And so I wouldn't be surprised if there's still this misogynistic, transphobic undercurrent that is across all our movements. And it's something that I, as a cis gay white man who is benefiting from their struggles, I feel I have the moral obligation to be naming that and to be saying the names. Iana Dior, attacked by 30 men this past Monday in Minneapolis, and Tony McDade, of course, murdered last Wednesday. And we all need to be saying their names.
That's right. And that transphobia is deadly, right? I mean, it's the same kind of devaluation that we see with Black lives, or that we saw with gay white male lives before, that makes it easier, as I said, to kill people, right? At the extreme. And that absolutely is something we all have to work against. Exactly. So I think we have some time for questions. We should take some questions from the audience.
Yes. While I
want to talk to you.
While I'm pulling up Vivian, because I think she's the one who's going to moderate the questions, I did want to ask you, because one thing that we did talk about when we were on the phone is the importance of the framework of war. That's right. And it's something you talk about a lot in your book, of why this one uprising, this one revolt actually needs to be conceptualized as a multinational event, and specifically a war. So I'm wondering, why is it, because I have my reasons for why I called it a war, but I think you have much more thought through reasons on a theoretical level of why war itself is so important. So I'd love to hear why you chose that term.
So I think this will work, because we often consider slave resistance just as a matter of kind of revolt between a master and a slave. You know, somebody revolting against the duly constituted authority of their owner, right? We don't think of it, often as people thought of it at the time, as a war involving strategy, tactics, goals for the claim of territory. And we don't fit that then into kind of a geopolitical framework. We just think of that as something that happens between individuals, or on plantations, or even in colonies, but not on that larger geopolitical framework. And that's what I was trying to do with this book. It was important for me partly because there were slaves at the time who considered slave revolts war. That's how they would talk about them. One of the most famous Black men, formerly enslaved Black men of the late 18th century, Olaudah Equiano, said, when you make people slaves, you force them to live with you in a state of war, right? So that was not a metaphor for him. So I wanted to kind of draw that out. I think it connects to your story in part because so many of the people you have, including Cameney, who are struggling for their civil rights, had been soldiers, or at the very least are contending with a state at war. The World War II, the Cold War, Vietnam, of course. I want to ask you how you think that plays out in the larger, how you think about that playing out in the larger civil rights struggle. Like, what difference does the fact that the United States is kind of continually at war for this period, how does that shape these struggles that you're writing about?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think also, you know, just as Tacky's revolt was part of a larger war, I think Stonewall itself, you know, you have to remember that was also part of a larger war. There were other violent uprisings before Stonewall. There was other acts of resistance, explicit and implicit, before Stonewall, and you have to talk about those. And I think what you mentioned about Vietnam is so important because people assume that Stonewall happened and a movement began. And what people don't realize when you talk to the people who joined the Gay Liberation Front, Gay Activist Alliance, all these organizations after Stonewall, they weren't just sitting around on their couches before that moment. They came from the anti-war movement. They came from women's liberation. They were fighting for revolution on a much larger scale and level, and then realized that the gay liberation movement might be the proper medium through which they could actually accomplish this larger societal overturn, which you're seeing right now. You show that
so well. You show that so well. And that's one of the things I was trying to do in my book too, is to trace these individuals through various conflicts. So that by the time rebels come to attack Userville, they've already been involved in different wars in other parts of the Atlantic world. You do the same thing. You trace these people through all these various conflicts, encounters, struggles, so that none of them seems discrete. Mm-hmm. And then you're really talking about a larger tradition of struggle. I was even kind of impressed that you followed Warren Scarberry, mm-hmm. the main FBI informant, right, to Attica, where he was actually shot during the Attica uprising, which mm-hmm. I thought was an amazing way to illustrate the kinds of connections that you were showing throughout your book, that all these various struggles in American society are united, or at least pulled together within a network of individual conflicts. And you show that really well.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, and I think you're seeing it now. You're seeing this is the moment. There were these moments in our past where there was this potential for solidarity between these discrete movements, and they were missed opportunities. And I think now, I'm very proud to be in Los Angeles right now, because the Los Angeles Pride, which originally had canceled its parades, has now organized a new event, which is not a parade, it's a march, just as it was back in 1970. And that march is in solidarity explicitly with Black Lives Matter and Black Trans Lives Matter. And I've made it my goal to make every single Pride organization in America do the exact same thing. It doesn't need to be a physical event, but it needs to happen. We need to recognize the moment we're living in and make sure that future historians aren't saying, oh, they had this potential moment, but instead they stayed home and watched Netflix.
And this is all happening. I know we want to raise questions, but I want to just get this in, because this is all happening in the context of a plague. Now, your book really just touches on the HIV AIDS crisis, just in the epilogue, just for a few pages. And in part, I think it's because, the main person you're writing about, Frank Cameney, says, we'll look back on this and it will be a nasty, vile glitch or blip in history, Cameney predicted. Even after a cure, he explained, you say, prejudice would remain, so he continued what he did best, lecturing on homosexuality and counseling those who face government purges. So the COVID-19 plague has now killed more than 100,000 Americans. The HIV AIDS plague has killed more than 300,000 Americans, I think, right? Mm-hmm. Do you agree with Cameney? Can we see these major plagues of the last several decades as a blip in history? Or should we really think harder about how we memorialize, commemorate, work those into our understanding of how history works? Because both you and I in our books talk a lot about these struggles, these political struggles. But the demographic context created by plagues has to come in as well. And I just want to get a sense of, how much you agree or disagree with Cameney at the end there. Mm-hmm.
I think all of the above. I agree, because that letter that he wrote came from his faith in the scientific process. I think he believed in science, but what unfortunately I had to cut 33% of the entire book in the editing because of the word limit. But the thing that also got cut was his letter to the pharmaceutical companies, to the manufacturer of AZT, saying, this is absolutely ridiculous. You need to lower your prices. This is a shame. You're waging war on our minority group. So yes, he had faith in science itself as a concept, but he also recognized that, he also went and got arrested on the steps of the Supreme Court in an ACT UP demonstration. So I think it's that melding of the science, having faith in science and progress, but also recognizing that that's often imprisoned by the political process and the medical industrial complex. And so that's important to recognize, but also it shows that in the middle of a plague, you see who dies first, and you see who is literally being killed first, because it makes the inequities in society even more stark than they were to begin with. And I think you saw that during the AIDS crisis, and you're seeing it now. And I think that's something that we could have done better back in the 80s and 90s. And I think we certainly can be doing better now about recognizing who is being harmed the most because of the inequities that already exist.
And it ties back to the way we think about war. I mean, both you and I are concerned, I know, with the fact that we live in a country that seems to be perpetually at war, right? And yet here with COVID-19, it has already killed more Americans in 3 months than combat soldiers killed in all of America's wars since the end of World War II. And then if you combine that with the total deaths from HIV AIDS, right? You're talking about, it's not even close. And yet, right, the President of the United States, as the COVID-19 crisis was ramping up, reacted much like the Reagan administration did in the 1980s. It's not really our problem. They laughed at it. They didn't think it was a big deal. They tried to wish it away, right? And now, when we see an urban rebellion happening, troops, soldiers, we've got senators calling for the 82nd Airborne on American streets, right? Where were these people when 100,000 Americans were dying? Where were these federal resources? Suddenly now the federal government is animated. As you said, it goes back to the larger question of like, who it's okay to let die.
And it's those people
that's
who
fundamental.
Right. And it's those people who are now taking to the streets, proclaiming that their lives matter, who were the ones who were dying during the crisis, right? So it's literally 2 instances of the government saying, your lives don't matter. And I think that's why I, as someone who's young and gay and cis, white, male privileged, that's why we have to be taking to the streets, period.
All right. Vivian, I know we have some questions. But I'm sorry to keep people waiting, but this is a really interesting conversation. I haven't had a chance to talk to Eric in a long time in this depth, and I mean, as you all can see, he's incredibly fascinating. He's brilliant. He's got a lot to say. So sorry, I took up more time.
No, don't apologize. Actually, I wanted to make a plug. There is an ask a question box at the bottom, so if folks want to ask questions, go ahead and put them in there.
Please.
Okay.
Honestly, there haven't been any questions, so these are my questions. I feel like I've been learning so much, and I wish I had taken your class as an undergrad. It sounds super interesting. Listening to you guys talk about history has been super interesting as a sociology concentrator myself, because the way that y'all talk about telling folks stories and tracking them through different periods of time almost sounds like a historical ethnography kind of, which was what I learned a lot of as an undergrad. So my question to you is as historians, both of y'all in your works highlight people whose stories have been left out in the past. And today, in this history-making time that we are in the middle of right now, who do you think are those people today in the moment that are being left out, and how do we uplift their voices?
Eric?
I think I already kind of answered that, so I'm curious about you, Vince.
I mean, I don't disagree with Eric's answer. I think, it's until we're all free, none of us are free. And so we want to be looking to, as Christ said, the least of these, right? And when their situation improves, the situation for all of us will improve. I think that animates, in some ways, why I am a social historian, why I like to think about history operating from the below, right? To think about the people who've been left out of the main story, and talk about how they shape the way history turns out. And as you see in Eric's book, and as I try to show in my own book, it's mostly because we have these prejudgments about who matters and who doesn't matter, that we tell the stories the way they do. As soon as you begin to look, you find that they're fundamentally important to everything that happens. So just a brief example, the 7 Years' War between Britain, France, and Spain in the mid-18th century is what many people, historians as well, call the First European World War. Tacky's Revolt in Jamaica, which was Britain's most profitable, most militarily significant, and most politically significant colony in the Americas, was one of the largest revolts, one of the largest battles of the 7 Years' War. And yet historians of the 7 Years' War traditionally leave it out. This despite the fact that many of the soldiers and sailors and Marines who fought in other of the more famous campaigns of the 7 Years' War in Montreal, in Senegal, in Martinique, and Guadeloupe, came to Jamaica to fight this slave revolt. So the soldiers couldn't be under any illusion that this was something different because it was a slave revolt. It was part of the same war. And yet historians, because they know a slave revolt is something different, it's Black history, it's Caribbean history, it's African history, it's not part of that larger story. In some ways, I think we're still dealing with the legacies of the basic assumptions of racist philosophy and history of the 19th century. The philosopher G.W.F. Hegel, who is in some ways the father of modern Western philosophy, said in the early 19th century that Africa forms no historical part of the world. And so what happens there, and the people who come from there, just don't matter. What they do doesn't matter. There's no historical movement. There's no transformation to be seen. And I think that Eric and I are both engaged in the process of trying to disprove that 250 years later.
Yeah. All right. Another question I had was that history is often seen as a discipline in the academy. And Dr. Brown, obviously, you are in the academy, and both of you have PhDs, but both of you have worked to push your work beyond the academy. What role does history play in pop culture, in the world outside of the academy generally, and how do we make it more accessible?
Well, I give credit again.
You're doing it.
I give credit to you, though. I mean, I'll never forget sitting in your office and, you telling me that it doesn't just have to be a book, that it can be more. And one thing we did in the History Design Studio was have a different guest and I would encourage any scholars watching to emulate the History Design Studio, your creation, which is to bring in a different storyteller of history, whether it's someone who designs museum exhibits, whether it's someone who uses coding in order to demonstrate visually how history functions. These are important, valid modes of telling history and of historical inquiry that I think are still a bit obscure. I don't know many other history design studios, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we have to start thinking outside of the box, especially right now as we're all on Crowdcast having this conversation, and suddenly, everything is going digital. I believe all of Harvard next semester is going digital. Is that right?
Yeah, it's still to be determined, but certainly a lot of our teaching will be online.
So that just goes to show books will always be important, but there has to be a way, especially now, to make it more accessible as people are increasingly on their phones, increasingly plugged in, to make history alive and human, and get people interested in the book. As all the fun videos I do, at the end of the day, I hope they buy the book, because that's, the 100 pages of endnotes I hope people read, or the historians, because that also matters. Yeah. So I think there's ways of layering it.
Yeah. I'll try to be as brief as possible, but we all know that, we don't learn all our history from books and articles, or from historians for that matter. They weren't really teaching the history of slavery in elementary school and high school when I was growing up in San Diego, California. And so I learned the first lessons about the history of slavery really from musicians, especially from reggae musicians. It's probably one of the reasons why I'm so interested and have been writing for 25 years on Jamaica. That history came to me through musicians. Some of our history comes to us through our parents, right? The stories handed down to us through families. That's real history. Now, what I think historians bring to the table, as Eric alluded to, is a sense of how one can document and demonstrate the truth of our claims, right? To really say, here's how I can prove to you that this is likely to have happened the way I said it happened. But that itself, that imperative, that doesn't have to take the form of an article. It doesn't have to take the form of a book. It doesn't have to take the form of print. One can figure out how to verify our truth claims in other kinds of media. And I think that we need to do that, especially as people encounter information through a variety of media that are not books these days, and not even in print.
Yeah. Plug for Eric's Instagram page.
Absolutely.
We have time for one more question. Somebody, Glenn, asked in the Crowdcast, are there any individuals whose lives and legacies are in an intersection of a Venn diagram? For instance, the Black rights and queer rights movement. Bayard Rustin comes to mind.
Yeah.
Yeah, amen.
He comes to mind.
Bayard comes to mind. He's phenomenal. I think one of the chapters titled "The March" begins with him, and I think especially what I love doing. Vince, you brought it up a little bit, but one of my favorite things is telling history through the perspective of the oppressor or through surveillance, because I think it's so fascinating to see the mechanisms behind surveillance and also the mechanisms of persecution from within the bureaucracy, because it's important to see what they're telling themselves. And one of the things you see from the FBI file is immediately after Rustin and Randolph announce the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, the FBI starts hearing chatter from their informants within the homophile movement that they were going to replicate this march that's getting all this media attention, and for the first time have an organized demonstration for gay rights. And you see the FBI file going from J. Edgar Hoover's desk to the Secret Service informing the White House of this fact. And so you see again this moment of maybe Rustin at that moment was working, even though he was a gay Black man, he was working for the Black freedom movement. But there's this moment where the government recognizes that there is a potential, a dangerous potential of solidarity, of coming together, and both movements rising at the same time against oppression from the same source. Yeah. And they're terrified. Of course, it takes a couple more years before they're protesting, but you see what the state is actually afraid of.
Yeah, fantastic. I just find those intersections to be some of the most exciting things one finds in history. To be able to kind of find people that are engaged in multiple struggles that are unexpected, right? Mm-hmm. To see those unexpected connections really remaps the way we organize our understanding of history. And that's when it becomes really exciting.
Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons I brought up, I opened the book. I had to fight for it. I had to open the book with this sexual encounter in a public restroom, because it's that moment where you're caught and you don't have the choice anymore to hide that part of your identity, because the state has labeled you as a sexual deviant. And that is the radicalizing moment. That was the radicalizing moment for Frank Cameney. And less explicitly, even though it was against his choice, for Rustin as well in Pasadena in '53. There are destinies, even though I don't believe they ever met, were always intertwined, and we have to tell both of their stories.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, I think that's all the time we have, but I think that's a perfect place to kind of end on our theme, which is that Black is beautiful, is gay, and gay is good, and that is that.
And that is that. Oh, thank you. Oh, man. Well, Vince, thank you so much. I mean, I meant it when I said you're an academic and personal hero. And I hope everyone click the little eye next to at the top of the page. Buy from, no matter what book you're buying, get from the independent bookshops. They all need our love right now. But Tacky's Revolt, I think you have to understand that war in order to understand the Deviants War. So consider getting both. Thank you so much, Vince, again, Vivian, and our amazing co-hosts. I will see you all soon. And thank you for joining.
I wish we could have been in South Beach next time. Maybe.
Next time for the paperback. For the paperback.
Yes. Let's do it. For the audio book, even.
Yeah. Amen.